China's war for Taiwan has already begun. It just exists below the threshold of a conflict. No missiles have to launch for Beijing to start changing the battlefield, and shots don't have to be fired for Taiwan to be surrounded, exhausted, and intimidated. And that is the point of China's current shadow war. It lets Beijing pressure Taiwan without triggering the full consequences of a real invasion. That makes this one of the most dangerous parts of the entire problem with Taiwan, because China's non-war tools are not secondary to its military strategy. They appear to be the main strategy, at least for right now. The core insight is that China may not agree to invade Taiwan tomorrow if it can slowly make Taiwan weaker today. It has normalized the ships and the aircraft that fly and sail around the island, as well as the missiles that occasionally overfly the island. It frames this coercion as law enforcement and as regular military exercises. These moves appear too small to justify escalation, but together they reshape the environment that Taiwan has to live in, and they normalize this level of pressure. This is why this section of the analysis follows the previous three sections. China can be choked at sea if Taiwan threatens the maritime flows that feed its economy and military. The war would also crash China's economy by triggering sanctions. And China's pressure campaigns are already creating the regional coalition that Beijing is attempting to avoid. So if outright war is that risky, then the gray zone becomes much more attractive. It gives Beijing a way to attack Taiwan's confidence before attacking Taiwan directly. This is what makes the gray zone warfare so effective. Rusi frames Taiwan as one of the clearest case studies in gray zone competition, where China uses coercive activity below the threshold of armed conflict to wear down Taiwan's resilience and test responses. That threshold between gray zone warfare and really more conventional warfare is the whole game here. The blockade may look like a conflict, and missile strikes certainly look like a conflict, but Coast Guard inspections, cyber attacks, import bans, and disinformation campaigns, as well as the weekly and almost daily air and naval patrols, certainly are short of a war. That ambiguity buys Beijing significant amounts of time. It makes Taiwan respond constantly while making foreign governments debate what the response should be. It forces Taipei to spend massive amounts of money, scramble its aircraft, harden its networks, and reassure its citizens. And it lets China gather large amounts of intelligence, train its forces, and map Taiwan's reactions. The goal is not always dramatic crisis, but it is to make the pressure feel like it's routine. The maritime layer is the most visible part of this strategy. China's Coast Guard can do things that look less escalatory than if the PLA Navy were to do it, while still putting physical pressure on Taiwan. It can patrol and harass all kinds of Taiwanese vessels, and it can make a dispute look like a law enforcement issue rather than an act of military aggression. This is really important because the closer that China can make coercion look like it's administrative, the harder it can become for other countries to agree where exactly the red line is. This is the logic behind a Taiwanese quarantine. CSIS has mapped scenarios where China could use the Coast Guard and other law enforcement forces to impose a gray zone quarantine on Taiwan, presenting the operation as customs enforcement rather than a military blockade. So whereas a blockade would be conducted by military forces and would be an explicit statement of cutting a country off, a quarantine says that they are inspecting what enters the territory that they claim is theirs with law enforcement forces. The practical effect is still coercive. It delays shipping and it causes companies to reconsider the safety of operating in Taiwan, but the legal framing is designed to blur the response by other countries like the United States. This is why the Chinese Coast Guard is so dangerous in this scenario. It gives China a way to create a blockade-like pressure without immediately accepting blockade-level risk. CSIS warns that casting a quarantine as law enforcement could help Beijing deflect and dilute international pressure by making the crisis look less like war and more like customs. What it is not is peaceful, but what it is difficult to categorize. And in a crisis, that classification is very important because governments respond differently to policing or military coercion or an open war. China is also trying to make its legal claims feel real through repetition. The US Naval War College's China Maritime Report explains that Beijing treats the Taiwan Strait as divided into multiple maritime zones, where it claims different forms of control, implying a right to exercise jurisdiction across waters other countries treat very differently. This is also often referred to as lawfare, which is using legal language or domestic regulations to justify patrols, warnings, or administrative procedures, all to make a political claim look like an already existing political or legal reality. If China can repeatedly act like it has authority around Taiwan, it can slowly make others behave as if that authority has to be factored into every single decision. The maritime militia adds yet another layer. These are not always clearly marked military assets. They can look like fishing boats, commercial vessels, or regular civilian traffic, while still helping Beijing assert presence, gather information, complicate enforcement, and create swarming pressures on Taiwan. CSIS analyzed nearly 12,000 vessels near Taiwan and narrowed the dataset to an estimated 128 to 209 ships showing suspicious loitering and non-fishing behavior consistent with possible gray zone activity. The point is not that every suspicious vessel is a secret agent, the point is that ambiguity itself is useful. It makes Taiwan police the space between civilian movement and state-backed coercion. Recent activity around the Pratas Islands have shown what this looks like in real life. A Chinese Coast Guard vessel recently entered the waters near the Taiwan-controlled Pratas Islands, claiming jurisdiction and withdrawing only after tense responses from the Taiwanese Coast Guard. This is important because the Pratas sits between southern Taiwan and Hong Kong, far from Taiwan's mainland and exposed to that kind of maritime pressure. Taiwan does not have to seize the island for this incident to matter. It only needs to keep testing whether its presence can become normal and whether Taiwan's response looks isolated or if they begin to wear down over time. The air and naval pressure campaign does the same thing as the naval campaign, but in a different direction. PLA aircraft and ships around Taiwan are not just symbols of Chinese strength around Taiwan. They train Chinese forces, they stress Taiwan's readiness, and they map responses. They also shift the baseline from what the region considers to be normal activity. CSIS found that China's military activity increased across the Taiwan Strait, as well as in the South China Sea, near Japan, and beyond the First Island chain throughout 2025, with near record level pressures around Taiwan. This is exactly how this shadow war, gray zone warfare works. The abnormal becomes normal through repetition. The goal is to make Taiwan live in a pre-war environment while the rest of the world treats it as routine. Taiwan has to track all of the aircraft and ships, and they have to scramble a response. China gets training value every time Taiwan does that. It sees what they're sending and how long it takes them to send it. It also gets political value every time the world decides to just shrug and look the other way. These patrols are still active to this very moment as well. The invisible front, though, may be even more important. China's shadow war is not limited to just the sea and the air. It also targets networks that Taiwan needs to function, whether that's in government systems or in civilian sectors like the medical field, the energy grid, telecommunications, or transportation. Taiwan's National Security Bureau assessed that Chinese cyber actors launched an average of 2.63 million intrusion attempts per year against Taiwan's critical infrastructure just in 2025 across 9 key sectors. That's a huge number, and that constant cyber pressure is by design. It doesn't need to produce one spectacular blackout or cyber breach to shape the conflict. It allows China to probe, map, steal, and pre-position assets for an actual shooting conflict. Cyber operations are valuable because they create options before the crisis begins. If China ever decides to escalate militarily, it'll want to know which networks can be disrupted and which grids can be blacked out. It'll want to know how Taiwan's government communicates under pressure, and it wants access to the power grid, the hospitals, transportation, media, finance, and emergency services. The cyber domain is not often just a secondary domain, it can be the main enabler for kinetic action. Information warfare often works in the exact same way. Beijing does not need every Taiwanese citizen to become pro-China. It needs enough doubt, fear, and cynicism and division to make resistance feel more difficult or futile. It can push narratives that the United States will abandon Taiwan, citing historical examples. It can portray Taiwanese leaders as divided and reckless, and it can amplify corruption claims, social tensions, and military anxiety. And this is why political elections really matter a lot here. Taiwan's 2024 election became a testing ground for influence operations, including AI-generated or AI-enhanced content. Microsoft tracks CCP-linked influence actors, increasing their use of AI-generated content around the world, including activity tied to Taiwan's election environment. Other research on generative AI in Taiwan's 2024 election found that PRC state and non-state actors used AI-enabled disinformation, including deep-faced and biased content, while Taiwan worked to counter those efforts themselves. The goal here was not for China to pick the winner directly. Sometimes the goal is really just to make the winner govern a society that feels more divided, distrustful, and vulnerable. And that's what began to happen. That is really the deeper purpose of information warfare in China's strategy. They're trying to make the Taiwanese people question whether they can survive on their own in a conflict, whether allies are actually going to come to their aid, and if their leadership or military is actually capable of meeting the resistance that they expect. Economic coercion is another part of the same machine. Beijing can punish sectors, companies, farms, exporters, and all kinds of other industries without having to fire any kind of shot. The Stimson Center describes Chinese economic coercion as a recurring tool that the United States, Japan, and Taiwan need to coordinate against. Taiwanese products have repeatedly faced restrictions under technical justifications like inspections, pests, or regulatory concerns, while the political message is clear enough for everyone to understand. This is pressure through market access. It tells Taiwanese society that political choices have economic consequences. That kind of coercion works best when it is selective. Beijing does not need to cut all trade with Taiwan. It can target politically sensitive sectors, it can hurt regions, industries, or companies linked to parties or positions that it doesn't like, and it can make business elites ask whether democracy is becoming too expensive. And so the economic domain is becoming a domain that is involved in this conflict. Finally, we can talk about lawfare because that's the interesting thing that ties all of this together. It's really how China is trying to turn this coercion into administrative procedure. This is how they basically justify the Coast Guard turning patrols into jurisdictions and inspections into customs enforcement. The point is to make Taiwan's autonomy look like an exception to Chinese authority rather than a reality that China has not yet overcome. And this is why China's shadow war is such a hard thing to address. If Taiwan responds too weakly, then Beijing has changed successfully the baseline. If Taiwan responds too aggressively, Beijing portrays Taipei as provocative and the aggressor. If the United States responds too little or too much, then deterrence either erodes or they claim foreign interference. Overreaction is helping China's narrative, but underreaction is really helping their position. This is exactly why the shadow war may be Beijing's preferred path here for the near future. A full-scale invasion would trigger the maritime, economic, and coalition risks covered earlier in this analysis. A missile campaign could shock the global economy and invite massive retaliation, but a formal blockade would be hard to disguise and hard to de-escalate. But the daily coercion lets China accumulate pressure without paying the full price of an open war. It is slower, it's less dramatic, and it's harder to organize against, and that's the point. A quarantine sits between gray zone pressure and war. It would be more coercive than normal patrols, but also less clear than an outright invasion. It would target one or two ports instead of the entire island like a general blockade would. It also used Coast Guard ships first and the PLA forces behind them, and it would inspect cargo rather than stopping all shipping outright. And all of that puts the onus on Taiwan and their firms to choose whether they comply, challenge, reroute, or escalate. That is a nightmare scenario for Taiwan. It's not instant defeat, it is a slow strangulation. It's a world where ships hesitate, companies delay, and Taiwan's public starts asking whether help is actually on the way. China does not have to occupy Taipei to create crisis and confidence. It only has to make Taiwan feel increasingly encircled and make outside actors uncertain about how much risk they are willing to take. But this strategy also has significant risks for Beijing. This gray zone pressure can push Taiwan to harden itself. It can push Japan and the Philippines closer to the United States and make Europe more willing to sanction Chinese coercion. And it can teach Taiwan's military, its Coast Guard, cyber agencies, and civil society how China operates before the larger crisis. This really works both ways. Every single patrol and probe gives China information, but it also gives Taiwan information in practice. That's why we see that Taiwan has leaned into exposure and resilience. The Philippines has used assertive transparency in the South China Sea by publicizing Chinese behavior, and Taiwan has increasingly tried to document and call attention to coercive activity around the island. That logic is very simple. The gray zone pressure works best in ambiguity, so one counter is able to make the ambiguity visible. If the world can see the problem, then the individual incidents become harder to dismiss. The problem is that visibility does not automatically create deterrence. Taiwan can expose the pressure, but still be forced to live under it. So we see that China's shadow war or gray zone warfare has two objectives. It prepares the battlefield in case the real war comes, and it tries to win advantages without needing a real war to achieve that. It's mapping Taiwan's reactions and it's normalizing their own presence. It's also testing the US and allied thresholds, and it's pressuring voters and businesses. And it chips away at Taiwanese confidence one small crisis at a time. So this takes us back to the crux of this analysis. China's shadow war for Taiwan has begun because Beijing is already using the tools that could decide whether a future war is necessary, possible, or easy to win. This does not mean that invasion is impossible or off the table. Beijing still needs to build its military operations, and the PLA is still rehearsing blockades, amphibious attacks, and joint operations. China is still preparing for a scenario where its coercion fails. But if a direct war is as dangerous as the previous analyses have shown, then the shadow war becomes more central, not less. It is the way that China can keep moving while delaying the moment of maximum risk. The danger is not that the world keeps waiting for the first shot. The danger is through the patrols and the minutia of this gray zone warfare. And so the question is not whether China will invade Taiwan. The question is how much damage China can do before the invasion becomes necessary. And so to tie it into the rest of the series, we see that China can be pressured at sea, it can be shocked economically, and it can create the coalition that it fears the most, but it also has a powerful alternative to open war. It can pressure Taiwan until the island and the world around it slowly adjust to the Chinese control. The war may not announce itself with any traditional initiation of the war. It may just begin with ships, cyber attacks, inspections, and quarantines, as well as patrols that teach Taiwan that it is surrounded without ever giving the world one clean moment to respond. Thank you for watching this video. Like this video if you found it helpful or informative. Comment what you think about China's gray zone strategy here, and if you think that it has been effective so far, and if you think that they will escalate beyond it. And subscribe for more analysis just like this. I'll see y'all next time. Later.